All right, welcome everyone and good evening. My name is Anna Tucker and I'm curator at the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience opening in New Orleans in 2021. So thank you so much for joining us tonight for our rescheduled discussion about the Jewish Orphans Home in New Orleans with Marlene Tressman. We're very excited to host this with her. She has just a treasure trove of information and stories that we're going to delve into a little bit tonight. But before we begin, just a couple of very quick announcements. First of all, we will have a Q&A at the end of this session. So as you're thinking of questions, you can go ahead and share them in the chat. You'll see that down at the bottom of your Zoom. So when it comes time for the Q&A, we'll be going through those questions. We have a pretty good turnout for tonight, so we might not be able to get to all of them, but we would love to see your questions down there. Also, as I said, we have a pretty big group here, so if you don't mind going ahead and checking that you're muted, that would be very helpful. And again, we want your contributions in the chat pretty soon. So finally, we actually had a very good question at the beginning. We will be recording this session, so it will be available on our YouTube channel. And if you need any help accessing that, you can just go to our website at msje.org. So I hope that you also take the opportunity to sign up for our newsletter. Excuse me, that's where you'll get information about all of the lectures that we host. We host them fairly regularly, and it's a range of topics from how Jewish is Texas history to how to take care of and curate your family's treasures. So definitely keep an eye out for that. And finally, and very importantly, we are only here thanks to your support. So you're instrumental in keeping our doors open, and we're excited and looking forward to the opening. So if you would like to support the museum, you can do so easily and safely at msje.org/support. So now that we've gone through all of those announcements, it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce to you Marlene Tressman, our scholar of the evening. So Marlene Trestman is also, in addition to being an author and a historian, she's also the former special assistant to the Maryland Attorney General and a former law instructor at Loyola University. She is a New Orleans native, and her first, but not her only, soon to be published book is Fair Labor Lawyer, The Remarkable Life of New Deal Attorney and Supreme Court Advocate Bessie Margolin. As you can see, Marley's already holding that up. So Bessie Margolin grew up in the New Orleans Jewish Orphans Home. So Marlene has just a wealth of interest and experience in that. But in terms of relationship to the museum, Marlene has been working with us to develop the museum for quite a while now. I'm trying to remember when we first came in contact. It's been months and months. So Marlene is part of our historical advisory committee. And I have to say, I've been incredibly impressed at how deeply she researched her topics, how widely she researches them, and also the passion and the skill she has with crafting these stories, these very important stories. So without further ado, welcome Marlene. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Oh yeah, it's great to be here, and Anna doesn't do justice to herself. It has been a treasure to work with her, and I can't wait to see the museum in action. We will talk a little bit about some of our discussions of things that have come our way and into the museum, but Anna is really just an expert in curating, and it's just been a real pleasure. So thanks, and I'm thrilled to be here. And I do have to tell you, I have a very personal and century-old connection to the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience that I have to share with you. It's almost 100 years ago. It will be 100 years in March of 2021 that my grandfather, within a block from where your museum will open, was struck fatally and died when he was hit by a streetcar on Howard Avenue at Baronne. And I believe you're at Howard and Carondelet, which is just the next block over. So muted.
Oh, and just a reminder, everyone, if you don't mind going ahead and muting yourself, that would be great. Thank you.
And so what I was going to say, what makes it a particularly Southern Jewish experience is it was March 21st, it was Purim night, and family lore is that he was returning from Purim services. So I'm still not sure which synagogue, but it might be right in time for your opening as well.
Oh,
100 years.
well, we'll have to check those dates carefully, I think, when we're preparing for our opening. So as you can already tell, Marlene, you have very deep roots in New Orleans. So actually, to start us off, let me go ahead and begin our PowerPoint. But you brought up a great first question that I have for you, which is, how did you go from being special assistant to the Maryland Attorney General to being a historian of the New Orleans Jewish Orphans Home?
Very reluctantly, and I'll blame it or I'll give all the credit to Bessie Margolin. She was someone who was a mentor to me when I was first leaving New Orleans to go to college. And when she died, I realized no one had written her biography. And I kept nominating her to the Jewish Women's Archive, Yale Law School, Supreme Court Historical Society. Long and short of it, if anybody was going to write the biography, it was going to be me, which I did. And while I was researching her wonderful life, I delved into the 13 years she lived in the Jewish Orphans Home. And I couldn't just confine myself to her childhood years. So I became enamored with thinking about this amazing institution. And also, again, a personal connection is the knowledge that had I come along 2 decades earlier, I surely would have lived there. I was orphaned at age 11. And although I came along in the 60s and the home had closed in 1946, I still was a beneficiary of the original home in that I was able to go to the Isidore Newman School that we'll talk about. I may be one of the only modern day orphans who attended Newman under the terms or under the spirit of its founding charter, which was to educate the children at the Jewish Orphans Home. So my care, unlike Bessie, was in the hands, the very wonderful hands of the Jewish Children's Regional Service, which is the ongoing, indefatigable successor to the Jewish Orphans Home, then the Jewish Children's Home, and today the Jewish Children's Regional Service. So I felt these were 2 stories I felt obligated to tell. And after those, I think I will hang up my pen and my maybe go back to something I have degrees for. But.
Oh, I don't know that. I certainly hope you don't, but we'll leave that door open. So I think that before we get into specific topics like daily lives and values that are taught at the home, I think several of our attendees, this might be one of the first times that they're hearing about the home, or maybe they've just heard about it in passing. So do you mind giving us just a broad overview about the home?
Sure, and just in broad brush strokes, and I don't know if you could show that next slide. Yeah, there were actually 2 physical buildings in which the orphanage or the asylum, as you know, that term did not have any sort of stigma attached to it as it does today. And also to start out with, there are lots of people today who bristle when they hear the term Jewish Orphans Home, because either they or their ancestors grew up in what they know as the Jewish Children's Home. I've chosen to spend most of the time talking about the Jewish Orphans Home because it was called that for more of its history. It was called originally the Jewish Home for Widows and Orphans, the Home for Jewish Widows and Orphans, from its founding in 1855 until it moved into the new building on St. Charles Avenue in 1887. And it wasn't until 1924 that the name was officially changed from Jewish Orphans Home to Jewish Children's Home. So I just wanted to sort of set that out in terms of the nomenclature. But the picture that's being shown now is one of very few, fewer than 5, images of the original building that stood on Jackson Avenue at Chippewa. And for those in New Orleans, as you can see, there's an iron gate post in the sort of at the front. Yeah, a little, yeah, over to the right a little bit, the corner
Oh,
of
this one.
yeah,
Oh, yep.
that is still standing. It has been left, even though the building, I'm sure, has been knocked down and rebuilt several times. Someone fortunately left that. The gate posts are not from 1855. I placed them somewhere in the 1860s, but I'm thrilled they're there, and you can still see pieces of the fence that are left intact. So from 1855 to 1887, the building was here. This building housed approximately, at any one time, no more than about 140 children, and it was bursting at the seams, even with an addition and a renovation. And it also housed 24 adult women who were either mothers of children that went into the home, or they were widows, or they were never married older women. So if you go to the next slide, this is an aerial view, which is particularly good because you get to see the quadrangle structure of the home. And this was built in 1887 on the grandest boulevard, one of the grandest boulevards in the United States, on St. Charles Avenue. This was not an attempt to hide away this orphanage in some rural area or in some remote part. This was the coming area in New Orleans, and soon to be populated with some of the most prosperous Jews and Gentiles in the city. The two wings on the side were the dormitories. The one on the left-hand side was the boys' dormitory. It was closest to Leontine Street. And when the building was built, it was soon, within a year of being built, its neighbor was New Orleans University, which was an African-American, a very prestigious university. And in later years, it was the Gilbert Academy, a very prestigious high school for African-Americans. We may get into race relations later. There was little, if any, communication, unfortunately, between those institutions. The girls were on it was first Peters Avenue, for those who know New Orleans, and later called Jefferson Avenue, which it remains today. And the girls' dorms were in the two-story wing on the right-hand side. In the back was the dining room and laundry rooms and facilities. And in the front was the infirmary, the synagogue for the years that it was there, the superintendent's quarters, and other administrative offices. So that's sort of the overview. The things I want to make sure you realize, though, the importance historically of New Orleans Jewish Orphans Home is that it was the first purpose-built Jewish orphanage in America. The Philadelphia Jewish Orphans Home actually opened 6 months earlier, but it was in a rented building. New Orleans also is unique because, even aside from, or even taking into account Philadelphia, New Orleans was the first Jewish asylum for widows and orphans. So it's unique in that regard. I'll mention also, I think New Orleans, it may come as a surprise, maybe not to people in the South, why New Orleans? Not only in the 1850s was New Orleans one of the major ports in the United States, but there were enough Jews to have the money to do this, or to get the money together, and not so many as to have really strong factions to make it impossible. And in fact, what happened in New York, some may think, why, I can't imagine why there wasn't a Jewish orphanage in New York before New Orleans. They tried as early as 1824, but bitter feuding between the Sephardic and the Ashkenazic Jews prevented their orphanage from actually opening until 1860.
Was there a specific event or series of events that served as an impetus for opening this, or a definite need for this?
Yeah, absolutely. 1853, 1854 in particular was the worst yellow fever epidemic that the nation had ever seen, taking the lives of some 8,000 New Orleanians in a single summer. So it was for the first time, and there had been the Hebrew Benevolent Society and the Ladies Hebrew Benevolent Society were both very active and supported Jews in need, which was essential because there were so many immigrants and there was always some catastrophe. But the founders of the orphanage decided they needed the permanence. They needed, because think about it, even placing a child with another family was no guarantee that in another year, another epidemic, another crisis, that the family would be intact to continue with the child.
Mhm.
And for many of these immigrants, there really was not another related family to easily take the child. So the one other thing that made New Orleans a particularly receptive place for this is there were at least 10 other non-Jewish religious orphanages in New Orleans. New Orleans was the site of the very first orphanage in America back in 17 something, the Ursuline nuns. So it was welcome that the Jews had reached a level of prosperity and permanence, that it was welcomed by the community that they would have their own orphanage.
Mhm. Absolutely. Well, and I think what you have painted so beautifully is the way that this New Orleans Jewish Orphans Home didn't exist in a vacuum, but it was very much reflective of the environment, the values, the events that were going on, both in New Orleans and across America. So now what I would like for us to jump into a little bit more, sort of what, even though I'm sure as we'll get into the home, I believe is sometimes it's succinctly called, the home changed drastically throughout the decades that it was open. But could you talk a little bit about the daily lives of the children? What sort of sports did they do, entertainment, hobbies, that sort of thing?
Sure. And I think one of the things, actually, let's go back to that just for a second. The picture with the chopping. For anyone who knows New Orleans, and if the building, the images of the orphanage don't ring a bell with your own personal recollection, this is a clipping from the 1950s when the third story of the home and its turrets and architectural, just they were not structural, they were just embellishments. All of that was removed in 1953. So I was pleased to find this article because it finally made sense why the images I couldn't put into my own growing up in New Orleans. The building, of course, when the home closed, was sold to the Jewish Community Center. And I and many of my peers attended JCC day camp and did all sorts of things, but the building didn't look quite like the one with the big turrets and the towers. So it was chopped off in 1953.
It had gone through
In terms of daily life, well, this is a picture of one of the dormitories, and this is the way it would have looked very early on. That actually might be some sort of, I'm not sure if it was just privacy or mosquito netting. That was not present in all of the images. But prior to the 1920s, when there were fewer children and there was a greater push to have the home become more home-like, it was transitioned into smaller bedrooms. But just in terms of the daily activities of the children, in the first orphanage on Jackson Avenue, so much time was spent in just keeping up with the sewing and the housekeeping. The older girls and the younger girls pitched in. The boys would be doing woodworking. They often had projects that could also generate income for the home, including a matzah making practice where they were able to sell matzahs to the local synagogues. And there was lots of emphasis every year with the anniversary of the home, always celebrated as close as possible to January 8th, which was, of course, the day that coincides with the winning of at the Battle of New Orleans was specifically chosen as a day of anniversary. And the children spent a lot of time preparing for recitations and songs and performances, and that continued through much of the home's existence. Schooling was in public schools for most of the time, except of course during the Civil War, when there were problems with schools not being open, and in Reconstruction with race issues in the school. Religious education was always in the home. Religious observance was in the old building. Sometimes the children were invited to Gates of Prayer when it opened on nearby Jackson Avenue, but all of their religious instruction was always in the home. By the time we get to 1887 and there was of course a playground and an orchard in the Jackson Avenue complex. Mm-hmm. By the time they get to the new home, that interior courtyard was a play area as well as the fields behind the building. In terms of daily life, one of the really important things about the orphanage is that it was known for being state-of-the-art at the time in hygiene and in health, having really strong ties with the doctors at Touro Infirmary, a resident nurse. And with each passing year, the cadre of specialists who were on call for the children of the home, orthodontists, orthopedists, ear doctors, a dentist who in the early teens had a clinic on the 3rd floor for treatments on Sundays and weekly and exams as needed. What's being shown here was also a prized feature of the home on St. Charles Avenue, the swimming baths, as they were called, which were in the basement, which was the ground floor of each of the wings. And this was to allow both for cleaning as well as water activities for the kids. It wasn't until the 20s that there were showers enough with hot water, plentiful hot water for the kids. But the kids were inspected weekly by the nurse, their scalp, their teeth, their ears, their eyes. They had regular checkups and were weighed and measured. So there was a lot of that, but we did soon in the early teens and 20s, the children in the home were the recipients of great bounty from people in New Orleans and from we can talk about this as well, the entire B'nai B'rith Region 7, which sent children to the home. And there's a picture which is extreme in terms of the kind of excursions that the kids would have. It's number, pages are stuck, number 10. This is from 1926, when I've been told the only one of the 3 women who are wearing hats, one has on a corsage, these were 3 movie stars, still of the silent films. One, the only one that's been identified, it was Claire Windsor. And this was not that unusual, maybe 3 movie stars at one time, but the kids were taken to the symphony, the kids were sent tickets to go to ball games, the kids brought on car rides, and most of this was all from donors who gave things. So this, I like this photo in particular because even though I don't have names on the children, photograph that many alumni or their children have marked with their person. I know that there are several Bierman in this picture, and I know that there were some Crystal sisters who are in this picture, as well as lots that I'm going to forget right now. But these, you can see the columns behind them. It's taken, it appears on the front steps of the home, and it was the summer of 1926. So I think,
oh, I was going to say, you brought up something important about people identifying some of their parents and their grandparents who are at the home. So hopefully during the Q&A, I know we had several people email in their answers ahead of time who are interested in how to find out more. So hopefully we can revisit how people can do research and what what resources there are.
Yes.
So before we get into some of these individual stories, including about the leadership and also the alumni, could you tell us a little bit more about some of the values that might have been instilled at the home, so secular and or religious?
Absolutely. I think it's important to also recognize that in the first couple decades of the home, it was really about making sure the kids survived, that the kids were taken care of, basic necessities. But it didn't take long before both the founders, the rabbis who were affiliated with the home, really wanted to make sure that these kids were prepared to go out and earn a living after they left. So there was a lot of making sure that the kids were well educated, superbly educated, prizes for doing well in their religious education, lots of talk about how well the kids were doing at the Laurel School and the other public schools that the kids attended. But a particular time in the home that I think really captures attention was in 1909, when a Haverford Phi Beta Kappa 26-year-old comes to be superintendent of the home. And he comes from the Hebrew Sheltering Guardian Society of New York and brings with him one of their innovations in governance, how they discipline, how they instill values of citizenship and hard work and good conduct in the kids. And it was actually based, didn't start with the Hebrew Sheltering Guardian Society. They were modeling something that came from Freeville, New York, the Junior Republics, which was a way of having kids, and sometimes the most intractable kids, really take ownership, gain responsibility, and that's by putting them in charge, or at least fictionally putting them in charge. So as this system of self-governance manifested in the home under Chester Teller, this young and handsome superintendent who came only for 2 years, it was called the Golden City. And it was this romantic notion where they could replicate in the home almost family units. And the idea was that the older boys and girls, those who really exhibited the kind of responsibility and maturity to be at the helm of a, quote, family, as it was called, were called big brothers and sisters. And these were positions of honor. And it really shaped the children's existence in their daily life. They were responsible to each other. The children had disciplinary systems. The superintendent was always the mayor and could veto or intercede as needed. But the Golden City lasted long after Chester Teller left, and into the time. Standing here in the middle is Superintendent Leon Vollmer, who replaced Chester Teller in 1911. And he was the first ordained rabbi to become superintendent. He came from HUC and had had a pulpit in Charleston, West Virginia for 10 years before he came to the home. And so Leon Vollmer embraced the Golden City, and it lasted throughout his time in the home till 1925. And he was really responsible for further embellishing and as making the institution of the home as home-like as possible. I'll give one example. There was a picture a moment ago of the dining hall, where it shows they're not terribly long tables, but they're rectangular. And I think it's number,
Oh, here it is.
there you go. And that was early, might have preceded Vollmer's time in the home, because a couple years in, he decided he wanted to make things even more familial. And he had the boys in the manual training department at Newman, where they were tending school by then, cut the big long table smaller. They were still rectangles. By the 20s, he came up with the idea they should sit in round tables. And by then, the president of the home was Dr. Jacob Warren Newman, Isidore Newman's nephew, I believe. And he was very much supportive of this idea of creating family life in the home. So in addition to round tables, siblings for the first time sat together regardless of gender and age, and each round table was given its own distinctly patterned dishware, again, to emulate these ideas. But it wasn't until Vollmer left, a new superintendent came, the Golden City was tossed out for reasons we can talk about. And it was at that point that the home was less insular and sought to integrate its children into the community. And at that point, we see the end of the home synagogue. We see the end of the home Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and even the band. And the children were intentionally integrated into the synagogues, the 3 Reformed synagogues, and intentionally put into groups that they would have joined if they were living in a private family. So
Have you noticed any reasons behind that shift?
Yes, definitely. Well, the end of the Golden City, it was starting to come under criticism that perhaps it wasn't really such a good idea to have older peers responsible for younger peers. And there were a few instances of abuse by older peers of younger peers. And so it was time for that to end its time. And then the other issue in terms of bringing the kids into the community, the biggest thing that was going on by 1909, when the White House convened the Conference on Children, a very important event in terms of how institutional and dependent children were to be cared for, the call to end institutions like the home, like the 500 and 1,000 children orphanages in other parts of the country, the trend was to put children in foster care, or by the time of Social Security, at least, of course, to support families that could keep their own children. The home was so beloved. The home was now supported by a B'nai B'rith region that enjoyed being able to send children to this wonderful jewel of a place in New Orleans where the children were well educated. So there was every emphasis, there was every reason to resist the closure of the home, but instead to turn it as, quote, home-like as possible. And that, I believe, is the reason the home lasted as long as it did, which was 1946. And my thought is that the only reason it closed when it did in 1906 is that the beloved superintendent, Harry Ginsburg, known publicly and by all the children as Uncle Harry, suddenly died in June of 1946, which I think hastened what was going to be the closure, but may have hastened it by quite a bit. So there were pressures to stop being institutional and put kids into families.
And I know we have about 10 more minutes before we jump to questions. And I thought it would be great if you wanted to share a few individual stories, either from women leaders in the home or from alumni or descendants. So are there any that sort of come to mind that you would like to discuss?
Actually, if you go back to number 11, it's a page from a scrapbook.
There we go.
Yes, and this is a scrapbook. I also want to give a really big shout out to the JCRS, which keeps a lot of its own historic records. And I guess I'll segue just a minute to talk about that archival issue, because for people, and I get lots of these questions, the case studies of the children, which of course would be of greatest interest to descendants, were destroyed, except where the directors of the successor to the home after it closed could find someone to return a case file to, that is the person themselves which is I think who they were trying to return them to, they were destroyed. So where documents do exist, and the largest single collection is at Tulane's Archives in the special collections in Jones Hall, the Jewish Children's Home collection is largely, I mean, it's a wonderful collection, and thanks to Kathy Can, it has been curated, and there is a much better index, but it is largely administrative, and it is only hit or miss that a few pieces of personal data are there, and I have combed through most of them, but that is an enormous collection. The other very important collection on finding tidbits about the children are the board meeting minute books, which from 1854, when the first meetings were held to organize the home, until 1939, those books are all at the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati. And the Jewish Children's Regional Service still has some of the original documents as well. So it is not an easy feat to do complete research, but putting together what wonderful people have shared with me and my tenacity at pulling the threads together and annotating and indexing what I found. I welcome people to contact me through the website, especially if they have journals or diaries that would illuminate the stories of their ancestors. This page I wanted to show people for a couple of reasons. One is the camp at Bay St. Louis. If I learned nothing from my research, it was the most universally beloved feature of the home. Kids started going to the Federation camp in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi in 1918, right around the time when summer camping was becoming a big deal. And Leon Vollmer was a huge proponent of taking the kids out of the home, giving them fresh air, letting them bathe in the Gulf, and they had lots of choices. The personal story I wanted to share here is, this is a page from a scrapbook that is in the possession of the JCRS. And although it does not indicate anywhere in the book whose book it was, I believe it was Annie Schneider's. And Annie Schneider is the mother of some wonderful people I got to meet in Cincinnati, and the Hirschhorns. And the interesting thing is, when I met Mrs. Marilyn Hirschhorn in Cincinnati, and she told me her mother's name was Annie Schneider, I told her that I could tell her who her mother's best friend was. And it was because I had met Liz Crosby, who I hope is probably on this broadcast, and she is the granddaughter of Leon Vollmer, and inherited her mother's scrapbooks of her own time growing up as the daughter of the superintendent of the home. So it is a joy for me, but it's wonderful to make connections. Of course, Liz and Marilyn never knew each other, although Liz knew a lot about her mother. Marilyn did not about hers, and so that was wonderful. And so this is a page, and it shows a couple things. One is that even the staff of the home got to enjoy Bay St. Louis. It was a break for everyone. In the far left, you can see that Elizabeth Josephson, the dietitian, and one of the girls' supervisors got to go. And then these are pictures of the girls at Bay St. Louis. If you want to flip just one personal story, my favorite has to be, go to slide 25, because this is the mother lode of stories. Got it?
There we go.
And I hope Hank is on the Zoom world out there. Hank is the descendant of 19 home alumni. And that is because both his maternal grandparents were both home alums. Both of his paternal grandparents were home alums. And his paternal grandfather remarried a home alum. And as you can see, I've numbered all of the siblings. And so Hank has been a wonderful source of information about all of these people. They include musicians. The story behind the Corn side of the family was a rabbi and his children. And I just want to take a half a moment here to mention there are no typical alums. There are no typical children in the home. And one of the things that I really want to make sure to do is respect the unique experiences of each child who lived in this orphanage. There were many children who prospered. They took the strict, rigid discipline and made it character building. And they thought it was the greatest thing, the education, and can't say enough about it. And there are lots of kids, of course, who weathered under the distance, the lack of personal and physical attention, or bristled and just did not fare as well. So I want to make sure that people understand I'm not generalizing. It was Dickensian for some, and for others, it was the best thing that ever happened, and every point in between. So I'll stop talking for a minute and
No, I think you point out one of the most fascinating things. There are so many different connections, and you yourself has served as such a great connection with Liz Crosby. Her images is actually going to be in the museum, as well with Joan Melman. I think we'll have a chance perhaps to talk about the medal that's going to be shown in the museum as well. But before we go on and start answering or asking some more questions, did you debunk any big myths while you were doing some of your research for this project?
Well, I think first is, and going back to this Dickensian notion, I mean, there is just the general sense that, there were children holding out bowls and, more food, please. And this is not to dismiss that there were young men who I'm sure did not feel sated at dinner time. But this really was run more like an elite religious boarding school, especially with the Isidore Newman exposure, which we haven't even talked about yet. And so I do think it's important, and especially because the New Orleans Orphanage, unlike its sisters, Jewish orphanages in Cleveland with some 500, 600 kids, or in New York topping over 1,000, this was at most in the St. Charles Avenue home only briefly topped 173, and only for 2 months. And then it started declining. So this was a very small population that was able to be maintained even during, sparse money times. And there were certainly lots of those. The other is, and maybe it's not a myth, but I had to be sure not to aggrandize, to make heroes out of everyone who supported the home. People are complex, and while the founders, I applaud them. I've never seen, there were 13 presidents during the time of the home from 1855 to 1946. The board met constantly. There were no professional staff who were social workers deciding on who should come in and what should happen. This was all being done by lay board people, but they were human, and they lived in a very difficult time in New Orleans. And unfortunately, there were lots, especially at the founding of the home, there were persons who enslaved other persons. And even at the same time that they were building the home, were offering rewards for runaway enslaved people, including children, described often with the same characteristics as they would have described their own or the children in the home. So there's, sort of just may not be so much of a myth, but making sure that I paint the portraits 360 degrees to make them as, as full people.
Absolutely. All right, I am going to give you an impossible task right before we go to the Q&A. So we've spent the majority of our time talking about the Jewish Orphans Home as an institution, but you've also written an entire book about Bessie Margolin. Could you speak just quickly a 1 or 2 minute summary about Bessie Margolin and a potential connection she has to Ruth Bader Ginsburg?
Oh, sure, sure. Bessie Margolin, the reason I wrote the book is, no one had ever heard of this incredibly important lawyer of the 20th century. And just to name her, most important contributions to American history is she was the only woman on the brilliant legal team that defended FDR's New Deal, specifically the Tennessee Valley Authority. She drafted the rules for the Nazi war crimes trials at Nuremberg in 1946 and spent most of her career defending and enforcing the Fair Labor Standards Act, which later included the Equal Pay Act, which led her to become a founding member of NOW. And on top of all of that, the most important thing is that by her presence in the Supreme Court, where she argued on behalf of the Department of Labor 24 times, she and a tiny handful of women made it possible for American lawyers and politicians to even think about there being a woman justice. Without Bessie and her few colleagues who argued multiple times at the court, no one could have imagined that. So the one thing I'll say is the book was favorably received. It got wonderful scholarly reviews and in popular press, but nothing beats the note that Justice Ginsburg herself sent to me. She had not met Bessie, but getting that was almost as good as a, New York Times book review. So.
Oh, I could only imagine, and I would agree with that. Well, Marlene, thank you so much for providing such a fascinating overview. I have about 1 million questions that I selfishly want to ask, but I definitely want to turn to our Q&A portion. So if you don't mind, everyone, if you will go ahead and drop in questions that you have in the chat. So we have several notes, so it's just going to take us just a second as we go through them. I will say there's one note I noticed from Ellen Cleary, who mentioned that she was interested to learn, surprised to learn that an orphan could often be considered a child who only had one living parent, as I think was the case of Max Mendelssohn. So can you?
Right, and to be clear, the constitution of the orphanage was to educate and provide for both orphans and half orphans. And so that was the term that was commonly used. The change of the name of the orphanage in 1924 was finally to rectify the case where the board had been stretching the definition of half orphan to also include children with both parents, but who had become dependent. And so that was in part the reason for the change in the name. But yes, it's really technically a half orphan was the term for a child with one living parent.
We have another question from Carl and Paula Zilonka, who were asking, was the home mostly a project of the reform movement?
Yes, it was. Even though there was great cooperation with all of the synagogues in New Orleans, it was reform in its both the books, the Sunday school, the Hebrew school learning. But it was a surprise to me to see in the Constitution that it was to be strictly kosher. They were supposed to, it was originally formed to be in strict adherence with the dietary rules, which was not mutually exclusive from reform, especially in 1855 or what became reform. But it was a pious reform Judaism. The children were confirmed. There were not that I could find any actual bar mitzvahs, but the children took Hebrew lessons twice a week, Sunday school.
I think you shared some Sukkot photos with us as well that were hosted. So the holidays were observed. And I think you've also mentioned some connections with other holidays like July 4th. Do you want to speak to that at all, or any other holidays that were celebrated?
July 4th was a big deal. The children would celebrate not only the nation's birth, but also the Golden City's birth, at least during that time. It became a big deal. It was fireworks and the band would play. And I haven't even mentioned the home's band, which is so important to so many people. So lots, and Mardi Gras was a big deal. The kids would go on trucks or were invited to one of the Honorary Matrons home where they could be entertained with food and drink and be right to watch the parade route. So lots of holidays, both religious and not religious.
Mark Mayer has asked a question. I'm delighted to read. He's asking for you to explain a little bit more about the Newman School connection to the orphanage.
Yes, and thank you,
Which
Mark.
was an entire slide that we skipped over. So I'm glad he asked this question.
It's an entire chapter
Yeah.
in a one-day forthcoming book. So it had been a dream of the home to provide its kids with training that would prepare them adequately for life. They felt that the public school system just wasn't giving the kids enough to then be able to go and get jobs. And so as early as the 1890s, the Home's board was very concerned and pushing to establish what was becoming the hot new way of education called manual training. And it should not be confused with vocational training. Manual training was a term of art that actually should have been called manumental training, but the term didn't stick. And the idea was, as Newman's motto later became, you learn to do by doing, to connect the hand, the head, and the heart. So 1903, there is finally a wealthy, generous philanthropist by the name of Isidore Newman who brought the dream of the home to light. And that was to create a school which the Home's leadership wanted to keep the kids not isolated. They liked having the kids in public school because they got to be with outside kids. And so it was the Home that insisted and didn't want to lose that aspect of their education. So it soon evolved into being outside of the home, but very close. The kids just walked 2 blocks away. And within its first decade, the other thing, I'm getting ahead of myself, by its founding, Newman School was to educate the children of the home first, but it was from day one also open to New Orleans children whose parents paid tuition. It was only for white children, even though that was not specified at the time, because unfortunately that was the way the race lines were so strict in New Orleans. I doubt that even if the Home or Mr. Newman had wanted, that they could have opened the school for both races. And so within the first decade, Newman had already started becoming a very prestigious college preparatory school. And the kids by that same first decade, the New Orleans children outside the home outnumbered the home children. It was a success. It was the first co-ed secular college prep school in New Orleans. And this is another historic aspect to the home, because I have tried, and I hope if there's anyone who's listening, if they've got information, I'd love to hear it. I believe this is the only relationship between an orphanage and a school that created this same relationship of a co-ed, secular, academically rigorous school that was available to the community as well.
Fascinating. We have time for another 2 or 3 more questions. So Camille Coleman has asked to hear a little bit more information about the Honorary Matrons. What was their role, and sort of what was their role in comparison to that of a president?
Sure. Honorary Matrons, when the home first began, was basically, I think, the Ladies Auxiliary. The Ladies Hebrew Benevolent Society gave a significant gift at the founding of the home. And these women were leaders, and these women were doing their thing, but it was 1853 and women apparently had to stay in their place. But the honorary matrons really were day-to-day in the home. For the first, until 1868, the home was run by paid matrons, an actual woman, a woman who was responsible for the day-to-day runnings of the home. But she was keenly supervised by the honorary matrons, largely women who were married to board members who watched daily, hourly, what happened in the home. But coming over to much more recent years, honorary matrons took on the added duty of becoming motherly to the girls and boys in the home. And there were really important relationships that developed. Bessie's honorary matron was Hannah Bloom Stern, whose husband Maurice Stern was for many years treasurer of the home, and they were a very high social standing. He was of the Cotton Exchange, and his son married Edith Rosenwald Stern. They were of that level of social standing. Edith Rosenwald Stern was the Sears Roebuck heiress. Other stories, one of my favorite is Dorothy Rosenbaum, her son tells me, was so close to her matron, Mrs. Irma M. Moses, that on Dorothy's wedding, Mrs. Moses gave her a set of china. This is after Dorothy had left the home. And when Dorothy would visit New Orleans with her son, she would bring him, these are much later years, to visit her former big sister honorary matron at her Joseph Street home. There are lots of stories about being shown the finer things in life, especially by the young women of the home from their big sisters, who were the grand dames of New Orleans Jewish philanthropy.
Absolutely. The next question, it's actually a comment that I wanted to point out from Ned Goldberg of JCRS. So Ned notes in the second half of the 20th century, many alumni later went on to join JCRS, even serving as presidents of JCRS, including Carol Hart. So, and I also want to give a shout out to JCRS, who've been incredibly supportive, opened their archives to us. So it's something where I think the home can't be told without the context of the contemporary JCRS. Jay Silverberg also asks a very important question, which is, when is your book coming out?
Well, I use forthcoming very fluid. It is under contract with LSU Press, and I am really hoping it sees the light of day in 2022, but the manuscript, they're still waiting at LSU Press for the manuscript, so you guys have to give me just a little more slack. Sometimes I feel like I'm writing it in real time, which would be 90 years, but I promise it won't be that long.
And we're all eagerly awaiting that. And until then, we hope that you'll come to the museum. Marlene is being an incredible co-curator for this section. We're also working on a digital exhibit where you can explore individuals' lives and special topics. Just because I know something we both talked about, what we're talking about is just the tip of the iceberg. We've often sort of shared misery over what's left on the cutting room floor. So everything that we're talking about here, there is a depth of research as well. So Lisa Levine asks a question that I think that you hinted at earlier, where if people have questions about family members, who should they contact? Where do they even begin to start research?
Well, I'm actually happy if anyone contacts me through my website. I'm happy to scan, take a look at the images of the registry books, which, and I have converted them into a spreadsheet so I can look them up alphabetically and, play, and sometimes the names change. But there really is not yet, and maybe one of the byproducts of my book will be a concurrent sort of online database, because there's going to be a lot of stuff where people have given me and have encouraged me to publish about their families, have given me permission and have encouraged. And I'd love to have all the things that an editor is no way going to let me put in the book be somewhere. But I do want to just, at the same time people are asking me for information, if anyone has a diary or journal or a first-hand account of day-to-day life in the home at any time, And if you're someone I haven't already spoken with, because I think I've asked you, but if you've been holding out on one, let me know. Please let me know. That's the kind of rich information that I'm looking for. So I have it for several alums, but I want to hear good, bad, indifferent, typical day, highlight, you name it. So
I will say I've been very excited to read through the chat. I'm seeing a lot of people make connections and have questions about it. One individual, Alice Wertheim, mentions that her family has her father's scrapbook of his years at the home, including his years at Newman. So we will be saving the chat and all of your questions. I'll be sharing this with Marlene, so she'll hopefully be able to follow up with you. And it's so hard to close out tonight's session just because I think there are so many more questions we have. Perhaps we'd be able to bring you back again closer to the publication of the book, more, as a celebration and diving deep into some more of these topics. So thank you so much, Marlene. Any last thoughts or summary statements you'd like to make before closing?
I'm thrilled that there will be a museum of the Southern Jewish experience. In my mind, the home is a Southern Jewish experience. And I just want to mention that, of the 1,623 kids who lived in the home and the 24 women, they came from 9 different states, 100 something cities. And when they left, they didn't even go back to the cities necessarily they came from. They spread across the United States, some internationally, and their descendants are everywhere. So it's a really wonderful, I'm just often awed at the reach of the home in terms of all of its progeny. So that part is really quite exciting. And I'm thrilled that so many people are so interested, and I can't wait to go through the comments, especially Alice with the scrapbook, because we'll be
Absolutely. Well, Marlene, thank you so much. This has been just riveting. So thank you for your time and your research. And thank you everyone who joined us. Just as a reminder, this will be available on YouTube later. So if you want to go back and watch any portions of it, or please share it with people who weren't able to join us tonight. And also sign up for our newsletter just so you can hear more about other programs like this. And always, we love to share free programs like this, but we hope you'll become one of our supporters. So please go to msje.org/support, and hopefully you'll join us for our next program as well. All right, good night, everyone.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
you.